This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open source Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have David Richards.
Hello.
Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
Now, is it Kimura? Because I've heard you say it different than how I say it.
You know, a lot of people say it differently. The best way I can say it is like, hey, Kimura a minute. So Kimura.
Okay.
Hey, come here a minute. I need help.
But I've gotten Camaro, Chimera, all kinds of things.
I'll do better. You can hear how guilty I feel, right? Yeah. So I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I'm going to encourage people to go check out thedevrev.com, which is a new video podcast that I'm putting out there. I'm going to release the audio too. I'm working on getting the process up around that. Anyway, Dave, you recommended this topic, and so I'm going to let you kind of explain what we're going to talk about today, and then we'll hit it from there.
So really, I just thought a topic of speculation would be fun. So really holds no water, no value, but just something where we can just kind of just openly chat about what you see in the community, the direction things are going, and what you like or what you would change if you had the opportunity. So, kind of a lot of this has spun off of my resistance to client-side frameworks like React or JavaScript frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue, that I really just don't see the true benefit of them in many of the applications. And then, so you have part of the community pushing in that direction of JavaScript frameworks, using those. And then you have the Rails core releasing something like action text, which is very different than the direction that the JavaScript framework is headed. Because with the JavaScript framework, a lot of times you can have your own static hosting for the JavaScript and the HTML files, and then just have that communicate to a back end. So you can almost host your website on S3, having everything served over CloudFront or a CDN, and then have all the back end business logic and database and authentication happening on a Rails API only. But that's a very different direction than what the Basecamp or the Rails core has taken Ruby on Rails with the introduction of action text.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're talking about essentially server-side rendered web applications, right?
Yep.
And we had a conversation about this on JavaScript Jabber a couple weeks ago. We talked to Phil and Divya from Netlify, and they essentially do this, right? So you server render your application, you hand it off to them, they host it on their CDN, and then if you want to add functionality to it, you can. But, it's mostly, server rendered stuff. And for content sites like devchat.tv, that approach makes a lot of sense. In fact, I've been playing with server rendered framework for the last, week maybe. I mean, Thanksgiving was in the middle of that, where I was essentially doing that. I was taking it to basically just rendering it to text, and then I'll have JavaScript animate anything I need. Yeah,
and, I think for many applications, that's really the way to go, especially if you're just starting up. I said it before, but I think it still holds water that a sign of premature optimization is starting a new Rails application with React. So if you use the yeah, and I really
I
think
heard screams. I did. I heard screams on the internet.
Unless if you're developing something like Gmail or something that truly, or Photoshop, a Photoshop online version, unless if you're developing something like that, I think that the business case for having a full-fledged SPA isn't there.
Well, what you're talking about is basically a fully managed UI, as opposed to what we talk about, or what DHH talks about with like JavaScript sprinkles, right? Where it's a UI with different functional parts.
I'm really glad we're talking about this, because I've been self-conscious thinking it was just my age, where I just think the old way is good enough. Because
David, here we go.
Well, the hip kids want to make these really beautiful front ends, but I don't know. I tend to get a lot of traction out of let's get something simple together now, and then see if we can justify more later. And I don't know. I guess I will never be as hip as a lot of people out there. But if I'm getting my stuff delivered, I guess that's what matters to me anyway.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, having a pleasant to use UX UI is important. I'm a full advocate of that, because otherwise no one's going to want to buy your product if it looks like it was developed 30 years ago. They want to see that you're keeping current, that your business isn't dead when it's a startup just getting off the ground. So having something with a nice looking responsive UI is a good thing. But that doesn't mean you have to go the full-fledged SPA side of things. I found more and more that, especially if I'm just wanting to stand up a internal utility or something like that, the overhead of adding in a JavaScript framework is really huge. Especially if I just need something from zero to production in a couple of days. It doesn't make sense. And then if I'm developing something that will be sustained long term, then you also have to weigh in, how much maintenance are we going to want to invest in this versus new features? There's always going to be refactoring and stuff that you have to do, but why add another component on top of there with the React components or Angular and all that stuff? Because you're just adding to the complexity of your stack when it doesn't need to be that complex.
Yeah, I ran into this a little bit. I've been working on the podcasting system that I've been building. I've fondly christened it Podwrench. But anyway, it was the same thing. I was looking at that and basically going, okay, well, I want to kind of drop Vue in and have it manage the UI. And it just turned out not to be worth it. I started looking at Stimulus and I'm like, yeah, this is on the speed that I want, because I just want to tell it, okay, when you click on this, do this thing.
And I think it's interesting too, because these are good frameworks. They're very well done.
Oh yeah.
And they feel great. And so sometimes I don't realize the complexity I'm taking on. Like it's an easy thing to just stand it all up and get it to do what I want it to do. And then I realize I have a lot of complexity on my hands. Did I need it? So it's a little bit harder to, I guess, if I don't really have to pay the price to stand it up, but I have to pay the price to maintain it or change it, or explain to the next person how to use this framework when maybe something simpler would have worked.
Well, the other issue that I have too is that typically I'm trying to pull it into a project after the fact. And so, I'll get going, I'll kind of get my ideas solidified around it. That's what I did with this project. And then I was like, okay, I do need some of this, things to slide in, or the forms to animate, and not animate in any fancy way, but just like highlight when somebody missed a field, or, things like that. And, just to give it that kind of natural feel to the UX. And yeah, so I went to pull in, I think I started with, I looked at React, and the instructions to get going with React, I was just like, nope. I've been podcasting about Angular for 5 years. And again, the barrier to entry, even though I understand the system reasonably well, again, it was just a no-go. I went a Vue. It still took me a while to get started. And then just to kind of get my bearings and figure out how I needed to insert it to get it to do what I wanted. You start looking at, I remember doing jQuery, and it's just like, okay, find the little handle, and when you click, then run this function. I mean, it was that simple. And, Stimulus has kind of that same feel. And so for my solution, and I'm not saying that this is the case for all of them, but yeah, I think in a lot of cases, it makes a lot more sense just to look at it. I mean, just to get going, there's this barrier to entry. And so just looking at it that way, it's like, oh, well, this is simple. It's easy to get rolling with. I can just put it where I want it.
Yeah, and I think that that's, a counterpoint to my point would be that when we do use Action View, we are prone to get lazy. And what I mean by that is having some partials or part of our view making database calls when all of that logic should have been contained within a service object within the controller or something else that is then pulling in that logic. Instead, it's really easy to create N+1 queries and stuff in the view, whereas with React, you're kind of forced away from that, unless if you're accidentally doing it in JBuilder or something like that. So I think that if we are going to maintain in our current path, we as developers need to get better about understanding our framework that we're using and make more proper decisions about how we are architecting the database calls, where are those truly being called from, and the overall interactions between our actual business logic.
Yep.
It seems to fit. I don't know if this is the right term, but the way I've been thinking about this, it's like this inside out approach to architecting things, that there's a DNA to the project. Like, okay, we're going to handle it this way. We'll use service objects this way. We're only going to bring in these other tools when we can justify them. And then that kind of creates an identity around the project. And I think if I can ever achieve that on a project, the whole thing goes well. Everybody knows what they're there to do, and they know what value they're there to add, and we're not going to rehash the same thoughts unless we're really getting it wrong. And then it's pretty obvious to everybody. Like, okay, it's time to bring in a front-end framework, or it's time to really have some empathy for the user because this is not working for them, or whatever. We'll wake up at some point. But I like having that inside out, simple things grow into bigger things. So if I can get my... And I'm a fan of service objects. A lot of people aren't. But if I can get the way I build the app kind of down, that's the hard part. And then everything else just is a workaday process. And then if I have to make big changes, I can later, or when I'm really ready to take on something bigger. That always feels good to me. I don't know if that's the right way, but it seems pragmatic. And that's what I'm looking for when I'm thinking about the problems.
No, I like that way of thinking about things where it's not necessarily that you're saying I don't want or I don't need a front end framework. It's, you know what, when I get to the point where that's going to solve a problem that I have, that's when I'm going to go and reach for that tool. I really like the approach.
And I recognize too that it spends a little bit of social capital. It's on me if I'm wrong. I'm going to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is why we're going to do it. And if people really wanted to use their framework of choice, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to build things. And sometimes, my reasons aren't good enough. But I have to spend a little bit of social capital to say, all right, well, we're not going to do that yet. Let's not do that yet. Or let's come back and talk about that when that becomes more important. And it's on me if I'm wrong. If it's on me if I'm... And that's, I guess, where my self-consciousness, comes up. If I'm just the old guy that doesn't want to innovate, well, then I'm slowing down the project. But if I really understand the cost of adding a framework or the cost of building something complex and then trying to maintain that over time, I mean, I've come to old projects that were built well, 10 years later, and they're still running well, even though all the tech they were built on is all completely defunct. It does its job well. It's secure and it's reliable, and I like it. It's not necessarily the plan, but it's kind of nice to think that people own that software. They didn't have to pay for 10 years of super duper maintenance over every little thing, keeping up with every new innovation if it didn't add value to the project.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the Agile development stuff that I got way into it a while back. I still believe in a lot of it, but it was essentially you're deferring decisions until you have more information.
Yeah.
And, so yeah, it makes sense. The other thing is that I find that the approaches between, especially Angular and React and Vue, are fairly different. I mean, they all use components and things like that, but they're reasonably different. And so there are going to be trade-offs between making those decisions or, something even more lightweight like stimulus or, something like that. And so when you get to the point where you're making that decision, if you have more information, then you can make the appropriate decision on that. And so it's not just, you being a curmudgeon or, a stick in the mud or anything like that. It really is, I don't have enough information necessarily to make a good decision. And I don't know what's going to change between now and then that would make me make a different decision.
And I think this gets to be even more important. I mean, I remember in the years prior when the Rails community was a community, we kind of grew our own people. It was, you were a Rails person. And now it's more, you're a web person. So I found on projects in the last few years, I get a lot of people on my teams that came from a very different point of view. Maybe they're not big fans of Agile, or they just love their JavaScript, or they came in from the DevOps side and they read an article once that they want to implement. And we did a lot of normalization in our thinking where we said, well, let's try to be pragmatic, let's try to be agile, let's try to follow these principles. They seem to work well for us and a lot of the people that we know. And so being willing to say, I'm going to build this project this way, and then being able to describe why and have it be on my shoulders if I'm wrong, and then also be willing to listen to somebody that's got a perspective that I've never considered or I haven't thought about for a while. It's not that I have to be right, but if I'm going to set a project in a direction, then I kind of need to be able to have that conversation with people in a productive way. But they're coming from, a much, much more varied backgrounds these days, which is great. It's great to have that, but it just means the conversation's more and more important.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases, it's good to see what's out there, to see what's new, and to jump on new technologies, especially early on if they end up being a hit. That makes you a early pioneer in that area, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, when you start introducing new technology into the core business function of your application, then you start introducing a lot of risk, as well as introducing a lot of unknowns that you can't yet calculate because you don't see the direction of the community. I admit that I am not an early adopter of React. However, I have dabbled in it enough to understand a lot of its nice things that it can do, as well as some of the drawbacks of using it. And for more cases than not, I found that the overhead which it adds to the speed of my development does not outweigh the productivity required to push out new features or to maintain the application. And from that aspect, React specifically isn't a consideration. Now, once I build the application, if it's architected correctly, where I'm not making a lot of database views from within my database queries from within my view, then that will allow me to start adding in, as DHH said, some JavaScript sprinkles, whether that's stimulus or some one-off React components to give a more native feel to the application. And I'm fully supportive of that, but not jumping in head first thinking that I'm going to start a new application, it's going to be React, it's going to be API only, without knowing what the end game should look like.
I like that. There's another thing I've been thinking about lately that, let's say that I should adopt that framework or it is right for this project. Sometimes I'm not the right person to do it. Like I've noticed that sometimes I'm just novice or merely competent in a technology. If the framework is a little bit new or it's changing a lot like it does in the JavaScript world, I might not be the person to really lead out in some of these areas. In other words, I wouldn't notice the pattern that I'm using, or I wouldn't understand the deep expert level ideas that maybe aren't fully baked in the framework or in the ecosystem. So I've noticed that even if I get the technology decisions right, I've still got to consider that maybe I don't know as much as I think I do. Of course, I'll get in and work on a project if it comes down to me, but sometimes that's another good reason to hold back as well. It's like, well, wait a minute, I don't know enough. I could have the right technology and implement it poorly or implement it slowly, and it is expensive to build an expertise up in a framework.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. Dave kind of brought us around to another topic, and that's just being an early adopter, right? And kind of going toward these new ideas. And it really depends on what you want. I mean, some people are out to make a name. Some people want a community where they can go invent stuff. Some people they just want a technology that they can get excited about. And so they find one, and it could be a new space. But yeah, I mean, I don't want it to come across like we're poo-pooing the idea of going out and learning some new technology. It's just, in a lot of cases, it really pays to understand why.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I maybe I just, again, old school thinking, but the cost of developers is a lot, and I just think about, man, if I was building a house and I had that kind of expense, I better get a very nice house out of that. And so trying to keep the, things in balance, so that I can do a good job. That's important. And people, honestly, on the business side, typically don't know that. They don't know enough about what's going on. They have to rely on us to make good decisions, even decisions that aren't necessarily in our own personal best interest. Like, oh man, I'd love to know how to do the hot new thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, well, that's maybe not a good idea right now. Or I'll go do a practice toy project on my own time and then come back once I have a really good sense of how it would affect the project later.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
So one thing that I'm curious about, we were talking about like what's coming. And Dave, you kind of inferred that a lot of websites, don't necessarily need front-end frameworks. So I'm curious, as you've been thinking about this, do you feel like things are going to move away from front-end frameworks? Do you feel like maybe the web community is going to bifurcate into people who need them and people who don't? Or do you think we're going to continue to see a large adoption curve for front-end frameworks regardless of whether or not people need them?
So personally, I think that if we're just talking about the space of Ruby on Rails and maintaining an application long term, because no one wants to develop an application and then that project's over and done with, you never touch it again 6 months later. So if we're talking about something that you were hired on at a company or it's your own personal project and something that you're passionate about that you're going to be doing long term, then you want it to be maintainable. And part of having something that's maintainable is not deviating too far from its core. And if we're choosing Ruby on Rails as our framework, then sticking with Ruby on Rails as our choice and with its patterns, not deviating too far outside of that is going to help maintain its overall lifespan, and the ease of maintainability of a project. So if we are introducing in different components like devise, pundit into our application for handling our authorization and the authentication, then we've now deviated a little bit from the Rails core, but in a way that is argumentatively better to say that we understand that these gems are developed by third parties and we're willing to risk them no longer maintaining those gems. So we are going to use them anyways, understanding that risk. So now you've added two dependencies into your application, and then you then have a CTO saying, hey, I want this application to be React based. Well, that changes a lot more and adds in a lot more dependencies, because now you're not just dependent on React, but then you're also dependent on a lot of direction that Webpacker goes and how you're going to deploy your applications and its overall infrastructure. So, you start to making a lot of changes, and the more and more things that you start adding in like that, you're going to see the more and more you've deviated from the Rails core, which means the underlying core part of your business logic has deviated enough to where upgrading that to Rails 6 or later versions might become a challenge. So you may stick with a older Rails versions and not be able to take advantage of newer things like action text. Or if you're on a older Rails application, active storage, you lose, a lot of those benefits as well. So I think that as far as the maintainability goes, because when I start a project, I intend, or at least I come in with the intention of maintaining that long term. So I try to stick as close to the Rails core as I can with as few gems as possible. So to me, I would love to see the React and the JavaScript front-end frameworks die down a bit so we can kind of return to our center of what's the core is. And a lot of this is, honestly, React has not been around that long. Angular's been around a bit longer. So we have yet to see the negative impacts, or at least we might just now be starting to see the negative impacts that, this particular choice of a JavaScript framework has, over the DevOps side of things as things are getting shipped out, or from the maintainability long term.
I like that. I mean, a lot of these great tools that we're getting, they're built for a purpose. Facebook or Google, they're trying to own a lot of apps, and so they build great tools for that. And where 37 Signals now Basecamp, they're looking for the one person startup. How can somebody build something, good, a lot like Basecamp, if they were the only person on the project. And so it's possible that, we're all glomming onto these technologies that are great for their purpose. But like you say, does that fit me? Do I really want to own a gem? Do I really want to maintain things? I mean, much more than just the front end, that whole thing. How complicated do I really want this to be? Yeah, especially if I don't really fit. Some of these tools were built for people with a different perspective in mind.
Yeah, and I've talked to some people who are in the .NET world, and their views and their front end, they were really struggling with, even using .NET MVC5, which is a more modern approach to web design. It's a pretty cool framework, but to deliver stuff like we are able to ship with Rails was very difficult for them. Mm-hmm. So they added in React into their stack, and it completely changed the dynamics of how they developed and at the speed in which they could develop. So for them, it was a very logical choice and, a fruitful one too. They got a lot of returns. I don't see that in the Rails community where you're able to do, where you're saving yourself something. You're just, shifting responsibility over to a different stack that you're then going to have to maintain as well. For Facebook even coming up with React, I mean, honestly, if I was developing in PHP all day, I'm sure JavaScript will look pretty appealing, and then I would want to build a framework around that too. But I get to use Ruby. I love Ruby. Ruby makes me happy so much. I even named my daughter Ruby. So, I don't see anyone naming their child PHP. I'm just saying,
One of our listeners just texted me. He's listening to us live right now. And he reminded me that if the technology makes things easier, it will get used. This is from Rex Griffiths. And then he quotes Henry Petrosky, irritation is the mother of invention. So I think, like PHP never made me happy. I would never name my daughter PHP or my son. I got a lot of happiness from Ruby, but I had this immense irritation. When I started Ruby, I had about 1,000 hours into a project, and it just wasn't getting there. And it was a PHP-based project, and it's like I can't get there this way. I don't have enough bandwidth, and so to find somebody that solves the problems for me, it made it so much easier for me to just jump in and build apps the way that the Rails way. This is back in 2004. And I've had a love affair with Ruby because of that, because it solved things for me in a way that nobody else would or could.
Yeah, it was the same for me. I mean, when I first got into web development, I started, I was just doing HTML in high school, but I was just goofing around. And I got a little bit more serious about it in college. And I was introduced to PHP, but no framework, just PHP. So it was just kind of standard LAMP stack, early 2000s. And I really, really enjoyed it. I really loved it. I was fairly productive in it. And then I found Rails, and that was it. Right. And it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah. And for me, my first experience was with PHP also. And this, keep in mind, was back in 1999. So I built a PHP backend application with a ActionScript Flash front end. So it was a little chat application that me and my buddies would use. And, the thing was really cool. You got some instantaneous real feedback on the chat application with little, dizzle dazzles floating around. And it was pretty neat. It felt real time, like a standalone application. Flash thankfully has since died. But, I think that it's fun to experiment with new technologies. Really, that's my main thing is I love technology. I love looking into new things that I don't understand irritate me. So I look into them even more until I do have some kind of base understanding of it. And, in this, specific case, each time I always circle back to the Rails core and, try not to deviate from that too much. And I don't think I've drank the Kool-Aid or anything. It's just that I find that I am the most productive and fastest to develop stable, maintainable features when I'm sticking close to the Rails core. Very similar to my editor of choice, Visual Studio Code. Every now and then, I will download the EAP version of RubyMine to check it out, to see what's changed, to see if it's a potential fit. Each time, about a week of using it solely, I will eventually say, to myself, I need to get productive. I need to get back to work. And I switch back to my primary editor. So, being scared of new technology and new frameworks and stuff is a bad thing. Choosing not to use them because the business case doesn't make sense is not a bad thing. That makes it a smart thing, in my opinion.
So I guess this is the next question, because it's been 10 years or so since we've had Rails, more than that. I think it came out in 04, 03. So anyway, could and will something come along that's going to change the way that we, the three of us, and the people listening to us write code?
I think so.
Did you think so?
Yeah. Yeah, because technology is sustainable only for a certain amount of time before things have to change. And, with, around that same time, we had mobile devices introduced, smart devices, not just Symbian based OS phones. But with the iPhone and Windows Phone, Android phones, there's a lot of untapped market, I think, with the web space going with just full native applications. And I think that that's something that we as a Rails community are trying to avoid. I know there was a Ruby talk or a Rails talk about TurboLinks and iOS, and I've covered some on Drifter Ruby, writing a TurboLinks based iOS application. And I haven't given it too much more thought since that episode until recently, where I think that one thing that if you want your application to be used most often or more often, then put it on a medium where we have with us more often than not. I do not have my laptop with me that often to be working, on a website or, to be browsing around. I'm using my phone. And while responsive web design has taken us to where viewing a web page on a mobile device is pleasant, you still have a lack of native feel to that website. And that's where TurboLinks iOS jumped in to kind of rekindle that native feel for a web application, including using in native components, APIs for like the camera and the gyroscopes on the devices into your Rails application. And I think that's a really untapped Rails market where we've just kind of chosen to go the whole iOS route or the Android route using Xcode, Swift, and Java for the Android side of things. But other than the TurboLinks iOS application, there's really no bridge or gap into one of those natively. You have stuff like Xamarin, which is more on the .NET side of things, where you can create and cross-compile one code base to multiple platforms. And I think that Ruby Motion has come a long ways as far as being able to deploy Ruby-based applications compiled into Android or Java and Objective-C to deploy to native devices. But there's still a huge gap between Ruby Motion and with Ruby on Rails. Now, your interface between the two is going to be APIs. And I think that if we were to come up with some kind of gap, a bridge to that gap, then that could really change how we develop applications where it's more a true mobile first in mind, because that's a device that many people, the majority, have on them at all times, not a computer.
I think you're dead on with that. I mean, as far as interfaces and what we use, and I think it's hard to get an abstraction done well. Where we can move into the next set of tools. I think it takes some time to do it well. I remember how much complaining there was in the Rails world when it didn't do X. It was an abstraction. Rails is, the way that Rails does MVC, the way that Rails and Ruby and things where we say there's a trade-off and we're going to be on the, maybe in the majority of what people need to use. But like getting that into the phone, getting that into those interfaces, getting that APIs somehow tuned in smarter so that we can use these technologies. I think that is where we go. I've been seeing the same kind of thing around data, where people are finding ways to abstract out the hard parts. Like there's a proprietary MemSQL that's based on MySQL that's a distributed in-memory database, because that's a hard part of dealing with high volume, relational data. And so people are finding ways to abstract higher and make it simpler to get closer to our use cases. So I think that's where we go with our new tech, is we just keep getting better abstractions, but it's really hard to get an abstraction done well that really embraces the next. major push into the next, what really happens next. Is it augmented reality? Is it just getting onto our phones and actually using what's already there better? I'd probably put my money on just using our phones and actually taking advantage of that is probably where we're going.
Unless if you're Blizzard and shipping Diablo on your phone, in which case your people are not like that.
Well, it's interesting too, because the trade-off used to be much bigger. If I'm going to go mobile first, I'm going to cut down features. But the screens are getting bigger, the compute is better, the bandwidth is better, our different ways we handle gestures and the way we do things are getting better. So it's a lot less of a trade-off. And the fact that that's where people interact with us, that's how they choose to interact with our companies, with our services. Getting good at that matters more, I think. Last night, I tend to write these big flowery articles that I never publish because I'm thinking about this kind of thing. Last night's article was, the promise of the information age. But there was something going on. There was something in the air, in the mid 2000s. We were launching Twitter, we were launching Hulu, we were launching Netflix. We were not we, but the community, the world. All these things were happening kind of at that time. And a lot is happening now, but it's different now. And so trying to figure out where are we going, or where ought we be going, or where would I be happy working hard to get there? And so some of that to me also, like if we can get onto the phone, or we can get, more insight out of our data, or if we can get something that just adds more value beyond just, I'm going to record some values in a database and then spit it back to you in a format that you need it. So getting, so that's, I guess, not an easy answer to where are we going, but I think part of that involves understanding what are the problems we've been afraid to address. And one way I've noticed that lately is there's certain kinds of search terms that are hard to get answers to. Like if there's, if I'm trying to find a movie, a showtime near me, that's no big deal. But if I'm trying to understand, the relationship of two complex ideas, or if I'm trying to understand the context of something difficult, or really get into and understand a company outside of what they're trying to tell me about themselves, trying to use information, try to build tools that make information more useful. I think those are the harder areas. At least that's what I've been seeing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where else to go from here.
Yeah, I think my rent's pretty much over. I mean, my opinions.
Nice. Well, anything else we want to jump on before we go to picks?
I think I would point out, though, this conversation was interesting to me because it's not so much that there's this, we're using technology wisely. We're not trying to break out of a bubble right now. And I think that's a really profitable place to be. This is where you want to be. The technology is solid. We know how to use it. Let's just get closer to the user, get closer to the business case. There's so much opportunity in this space. It's really expensive when it's time where we absolutely have to go into the next set of tools. I'll bet 5 years ago, this conversation would have been completely different, because of all the up and coming. But this is the time to actually be profitable.
Agreed.
Yep.
Because a lot of people think that the market is already tapped, that anything that's already been invented has been, and there's nothing new to invent. And I think that's, someone said that back in like the 50s and stuff. And look how far we've come since then. So, I'd say just keep developing, keep inventing, keep coming up with new ideas, and the world will adopt or not adopt it. But just because you failed in one thing doesn't mean you quit. Just keep going. Don't let it discourage you.
Yep. All right. Well, let's do some picks.
Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today.
Dave, do you want to start us with picks?
Yeah, sure. So I can't remember what my last pick was, but I've been having so much fun with this, so it may return to be a new pick. I got a dust collection system in my basement for my wood shop, and I have finally got it all hooked up and ran to my various tools. So if you have a wood shop that does not have good ventilation, then having a good dust collection system is important. And I kind of went cheap on it. I went with a central machine from Harbor Freight, but because it's not something that's spinning a blade, I was okay to kind of cheap out on a little bit. So a semi-decent dust collection system for your wood shop. Along with the spirit of wood shops, I did pick up a new tool over the holiday weekend, over Thanksgiving, and I got another DeWalt battery-powered drill, the XR. So it's a lot of fun. I like tools, and I like playing with wood. So I guess those are my two picks.
Awesome. David, what are your picks?
Right. I've got two very different picks. One of them is a book I finished last week. Love it. Amy Irvine wrote Desert Cabal. And it's a response to Desert Solitaire. I think it's 50 years since Edward Abbey wrote that book. But it's about the desert and the national parks in my part of the world in Utah and the Colorado Plateau. And it's just a very beautifully written book. So very short. You can read it in a couple hours, but very enjoyable. So I enjoyed that. And then the other one is something Ben Orenstein. We've had him on the show before. He's got this course out there, Habits for Hackers. And I love it. And so he's just getting it started. And a few reasons I love it. One of them is how pragmatic he is about it. But the other one is that he's doing kind of a study buddy approach to learning. I'll go take a class through this, learn better habits as a software developer. And I'll have somebody in the group with me that actually we're going to be checking in on each other regularly and actually make good habits. I think it's really hard. This show will come out around the beginning of the year, and we'll all be setting our New Year's resolutions. And that's not the same thing as building habits. And so his is based on a prior pick that I've done on the show, which is Atomic Habits, a great book. So it's a way to practice. So, hey, if we're going to be better devs, let's do a good job of that.
Yeah, Atomic Habits is an awesome book.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw out a couple of picks. So one of them came to mind when you were talking, David, about having the accountability partner when you're taking a class and things. And one of the things that we just did, we did kind of an extra episode yesterday because we didn't record Adventures in Angular or any of the Wednesday shows last week because of Thanksgiving. And, I wanted to have something to put in there. And so I had my friend Sean come on, and he talked to us about mastermind groups. And I found that to be an excellent tool for essentially leveling up and learning. And so you form mastermind groups. Usually they're formed in the business context. And so you hold each other accountable on your business stuff, the stuff you have to deliver to get your business done. And instead it was, okay, well, if everybody in the group is focused on learning the same technology, or if everybody in the group is focused on leveling up, from beginner to intermediate or something like that, then having that mastermind group and having the accountability and the ideas and all of the discussions that come out of that is really powerful. And so we did the episode. It was funny because we had co-hosts from 3 different shows on there. because we're also going to put it on Views on View and React Roundup. But the other thing that came out of it was that we're going to do a webinar at the beginning of the year. So if you want to come and kind of see how to organize a mastermind group and figure out how to make it effective, you can go sign up at Mastermind Hunt. That's mastermindhunt.com/devchat. And if you go sign up, it'll be free. And I'm going to be there helping with the presentation. So, it'll be great. I'm really looking forward to interacting with some folks and answering some questions. But it's essentially how I leveled up in a lot of ways, either through Ruby Rogues, which kind of acted as a mastermind group for me, at least in that way, because I was interacting with people who were at a much higher level than I was. And also just, as I moved from job to job and then met people in the local community, there were a couple of times where groups of us would get together on a regular basis for lunch and talk about leveling up or careers or technology or things. So it also works well for staying current if that's kind of your focus. So anyway, lots of ideas there. But yeah, so I'm going to shout out about that. And then I'm also going to pick, and this is something that Dave reminded me of a little bit when he was talking about sort of and I know that like the action text is probably a little bit different from this, but it did remind me that I have been playing with 11D, which is a static site generator, kind of like Jekyll. It's written in JavaScript. It's a whole lot simpler than Jekyll is. And yeah, I've been playing with it, like I said, for the last week, seeing what it would take to convert DevChat over to it. Because we're currently running on WordPress, and WordPress has just become way too complicated. And then, I'll set up an e-commerce place for people to, pay for the stuff they want to pay for out of WordPress. But, then it's just the store. It's not all the content, SEO and garbage that comes out of that. So anyway, it's been really, really cool. And I've been really happy with it. I've bought a theme off of ThemeForest that I liked for it, dropped it in. It's been kind of fun to figure out how to make all this stuff load my content instead of the boilerplate, but it's been fun. So so you can go check that out at Levity. It's 11ty.io for that one. So
interesting.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and wrap up, and we will catch everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.